A feeling of doom had settled in the air, thick and suffocating like the summer dust that coated every surface of their small shack. And Lee felt it in her bones, a low thrum of dread that had been building since dawn. Her mother had not spoken a word all morning, her movements sharp and brittle as she swept the floor with a ferocity that stirred more dust than it settled. And Lee, sitting quietly in her worn grey cheongsam, watched the motes dance in the slivers of sunlight piercing the walls and thought of ghosts. The silence was a living thing, a predator waiting in the corners of the room. Then came the sound that broke it, the heavy clop of a horse's hoof stopping outside, followed by a firm knock on the door. Her mother froze, her back ramrod straight. She placed the broom against the wall with unnerving deliberation before turning to face Lee, her eyes as hard and dark as river stones. There was no apology in them, only a grim, terrible resolve. "It is done," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "For your father's medicine. For your brothers." And Lee did not need to ask what was done. She had known, in that deep, quiet place where fear resides, that this day was coming. Her life was a debt to be paid, a small, fragile thing to be traded for the survival of others. The door opened and a man she did not know, a tall man with a sun-scorched face, filled the frame. He did not look at her mother, his gaze fell directly upon Lee, assessing her as one might assess livestock. He held a small, heavy pouch that chinked with the sound of finality. He tossed it onto the table. Her mother did not flinch. Lee felt the world tilt, the dusty air growing thin in her lungs. She was 18 years old, and she had just been sold. The journey was a blur of shimmering heat and the rhythmic sway of the wagon. The man who had bought her, whose name she learned was simply a go-between, said little. He pointed to the distant, jagged mountains that clawed at the horizon. "That's his land," he grunted, and said no more. Lee clutched the small bundle that contained her only other dress and a comb carved by her father before the sickness had stolen the strength from his hands. The landscape was brutal and unforgiving, a vast emptiness of cracked earth and scorched brush that seemed to mirror the desolation in her own heart. By the time they arrived, the sun was a molten coin sinking behind the peaks, bleeding orange and purple across the sky. The house was larger than any she had ever seen, a two-story structure of dark timber that looked like a monument to loneliness. It stood isolated, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the empty expanse. Inside, the air was cool and still, thick with the scent of old leather and something medicinal. And there he was. In the center of a vast room, dwarfed by a stone fireplace that was cold even in the summer heat, sat the man who now owned her. Garrett. He was a giant, his shoulders so broad they seemed to strain the fabric of his shirt. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and a web of scars pulled at the skin near his left eye, giving him a permanent, grimacing scowl. But it was the chair that held her gaze, the heavy, wooden thing with its large spoked wheels. He was immense, a legend she had heard whispered about in town, a gunslinger whose name was once synonymous with swift, terrible justice. Now, he was a broken king on a stationary throne. He did not greet her. He simply watched her approach, his eyes a piercing, pale blue that missed nothing. The silence in the room was heavier than the stone of the fireplace, a crushing weight of unspoken pain and bitter resentment. Her new life began not with a word, but with a gesture. Garrett pointed a large, scarred hand towards the hallway, a silent command. Lee understood. She was the housekeeper, the cook, the silent presence meant to manage the shell of his life. The first days were a study in silence and observation. She learned the geography of the house, the way the floorboards sighed under her weight, the path the sun took across the dusty floors. She cooked meals that she left on a tray outside his study door, retrieving the emptied dishes hours later. She never saw him eat. Her world was one of textures and sounds, the rough wool of the blankets she aired out, the smooth, cool feel of a porcelain plate, the whisper of her own soft-soled shoes on the wooden planks. The most dominant sound in the house was the rhythmic creak and roll of his wheelchair. It was his herald, announcing his movements from room to room. It was a sound of immense effort, of a powerful body fighting against its own betrayal. She would hear him in the study, the wheels pacing back and forth, a caged animal wearing a groove in the floor. Sometimes, from the kitchen, she would see him through the open door, staring out the window at the mountains he could no longer freely roam. His hands, which were said to have been impossibly fast, would be clenched on the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. In those moments, her fear, a constant, cold companion, would be tinged with something else. It was not pity, he was too formidable for pity. It was a flicker of understanding, a recognition of a profound and terrible loss that saturated the very air he breathed. She was a prisoner of circumstance, but he, she began to realize, was a prisoner of a different, more permanent kind. A week into her silent servitude, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The oppressive summer heat finally broke, not with gentle relief, but with a furious onslaught. Thunder cracked like a whip, so close and loud the windows rattled in their frames. With each deafening boom, a tremor ran through the house. Lee was in the kitchen, her hands kneading dough, but her work stilled as the storm raged. She heard a sharp, metallic sound from the main room, followed by a choked gasp. Peeking around the doorframe, she saw Garrett. His wheelchair was positioned in the center of the room, far from the windows, but he seemed exposed, vulnerable. His face was pale beneath his beard, and his hands were gripping the wheels of his chair so tightly she could see the strain in his forearms. Every clap of thunder made him flinch, a barely perceptible shudder that rocked his massive frame. His eyes were closed tight, his jaw set like stone. The sound was not just noise to him, it was an echo, a memory replaying itself with visceral force. She knew nothing of his past, of the event that had shattered his body, but in that moment, she saw its ghost. An instinct she didn't know she possessed took over. She turned back to the stove, her movements quick and quiet. She prepared a cup of jasmine tea, the familiar, calming scent, a small anchor in the storm-tossed house. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried the steaming cup into the main room. He did not open his eyes as she approached. She stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding. "I brought you tea," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and rain. He gave no sign he had heard. Hesitantly, she placed the cup on a small table beside his chair, within his reach, and retreated back to the shadows of the kitchen. She watched for a long time, and just as she was sure he would ignore it, his hand slowly unclenched from the wheel and reached for the cup. As the ferocity of summer beat down upon the valley, turning the earth to baked clay, Lee sought refuge in a small, forgotten patch of ground behind the house. It was a square of land choked with weeds and littered with stones, but a stubborn trickle of water from a rusty pump nearby suggested a possibility of life. She decided to make a garden. The work was punishing. She cleared the stones by hand, her fingers raw and aching. She tilled the hard soil with a rusty spade she found in the barn, her back screaming in protest. But the physical exertion was a release, a way to channel her silent frustrations and fears into something productive. It was a corner of this vast, lonely world that she could claim as her own. Each day, she would work until the sun drove her inside, her grey cheongsam stained with sweat and dirt. And each day, she was watched. At first, she only felt his eyes on her, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Then she began to see him, a hulking silhouette in the study window, observing her toil. One afternoon, the rhythmic creak of his wheels announced his approach. He maneuvered the chair out onto the wide, covered porch, stopping at the edge of the railing. He said nothing. He simply sat there, a silent, unmoving sentinel, as she planted the few precious seeds she had brought with her, melon, beans, and a type of leafy green from her homeland. His presence was no longer just a source of intimidation. It had changed. There was a stillness in his observation, an intensity that felt less like judgment and more like a deep, consuming curiosity. He watched her coax life from the dead earth, and she felt as if he were trying to understand how such a thing was even possible. The garden became a silent conversation between them, a testament to a resilience he thought had been lost to the world. There was a door at the end of the upstairs hall that was always locked. It was no different from the others, dark, heavy wood with a tarnished brass knob, but it held an aura of finality. It was a place of endings. Lee's duties did not require her to go near it, but its presence was a constant, quiet question. One afternoon, driven by a moment of idle curiosity, she paused before it, her fingers tracing the outline of the keyhole. She was not trying to open it, only to understand. The sharp, grating sound of the wheelchair approaching from behind made her snatch her hand back as if burned. "Stay away from there." His voice was a low growl, rough with disuse and laced with a cold fury that chilled her to the bone. It was the most he had said to her at one time, and the words were like stones. She fled without looking at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house seemed to shrink around her, the silence returning with a new, menacing edge. Later that evening, as she cleared the tray from outside his study, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, scraped raw with something that sounded like regret. "It was my workshop." She paused in the doorway, her back to him. He didn't command her to turn, so she remained still, listening. "I used to build things. Clocks. Furniture." The words hung in the oppressive air, heavy with all the things he was not saying. The past tense was a chasm between the man he was and the man he had become. And Lee slowly turned to face him. He was not looking at her, but at his own hands resting on his lap. They were huge, scarred hands, but the fingers were long and elegant, the hands of a creator, now rendered clumsy and half-numb. For the first time, she saw past the fearsome reputation and the broken body to the artist trapped within. The locked room was not a secret, it was a tomb for a part of him that had died. The first melon was a perfect, pale green orb, heavy with the sweetness of the summer sun. And Lee harvested it with a sense of reverence, along with a basket of tender greens and long, crisp beans. That evening, she did not prepare the usual bland fare of roasted meat and potatoes he seemed to subsist on. Instead, she made a meal from her memory, a simple stir-fry with a light sauce, the scents of ginger and garlic filling the sterile kitchen with a warmth it had never known. It was a risk, a deviation from the established, silent routine. Her greatest risk, however, was not the food. With trembling hands, she set the long, formal dining table, a table that was perpetually covered in a thin layer of dust. She placed two settings, one at each end, the polished wood reflecting the flickering lamplight between them like a great, dark river. She left his meal on the table and retreated to the kitchen, expecting to hear the familiar roll of his chair towards the study. Instead, the creaking sound moved in the opposite direction. She held her breath as she heard the scrape of a chair leg against the floor in the dining room. He had come to the table. She waited a few moments before gathering her own plate and slipping quietly into the room, taking her seat at the far end. They ate in complete silence, the only sounds the soft click of her chopsticks against the porcelain bowl and the heavier scrape of his fork. The distance between them was vast, yet for the first time, they were sharing the same space, the same air, the same meal. The silence felt different. It was not empty or hostile, but full, a shared quietude. When he was finished, he laid his fork down and looked directly at her, his pale eyes holding hers across the long table. It was good the two words were a bridge across the river between them. The relentless sun finally took its toll. And Lee collapsed while tending her garden, the world dissolving into a shimmering, black haze. She awoke sometime later in her own bed, the rough sheets cool against her feverish skin. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and her body felt heavy as lead. A damp, cool cloth was pressed against her forehead, and as her vision swam back into focus, she saw a large, shadowy figure beside her bed. It was Garrett. He sat not in his wheelchair, but on a low stool he must have dragged into the room, his long legs bent at an awkward angle. In his massive, scarred hand, he held the cloth, his movements clumsy as he dipped it into a basin of water on the nightstand. He seemed entirely out of place in the small, sparse room, a giant tending to a fallen sparrow. When he saw her eyes were open, he stopped, his hand hovering mid-air, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his stern features. He cleared his throat. "You have a fever." His voice was a low rumble. For the next 2 days, he cared for her. It was a slow, arduous process for him. She watched him struggle to navigate the narrow space, his powerful shoulders barely fitting through the doorway. He brought her broth he had heated himself, his hand shaking slightly as he held the spoon, his frustration with his own physical limitations a palpable thing. He never spoke much, offering only gruff, single-word updates, water morth, but his presence was constant. He would sit for hours by her bed, simply watching her breathe, ensuring she was safe. In her fevered state, the dynamics of their world were inverted. He was no longer the intimidating master of the house, and she was not the silent servant. He was just a man, burdened and broken, trying to perform an act of tenderness. She saw the deep well of loneliness in him, and the profound, desperate effort it took for him to reach out from it. As the fever receded, it left behind a profound change in the atmosphere of the house. The oppressive silence had broken, replaced by a quiet that was comfortable, almost companionable. Garrett began to speak to her more, not in long conversations, but in short, declarative sentences offered up like rare gifts. He would comment on the clouds massing over the mountains or the health of the livestock he could see from his window. He was sharing his world with her, piece by small piece. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch mending a tear in her dress, he wheeled himself out beside her. He was quiet for a long time, watching her fingers work the needle. Then, he spoke her name. "Unli," he said it softly, not as a summons, but as a discovery, as if testing the shape of it on his tongue for the first time. She looked up at him, and he held her gaze. "The rock slide," he began, his voice low and strained. "There was a shootout down by the canyon. A family was caught in the middle." He paused, his eyes turning towards the distant, jagged peaks, seeing a memory she could only imagine. "Their boy," he ran. "Right into the blast zone for the new rail line. I went after him." He looked down at his useless legs, at the chair that was now a part of him. "I got him out. But I didn't beat the mountain." He had not told it as a boast, but as a simple, factual statement, an explanation for the tomb in the upstairs hall and the ghosts in his eyes. The legend was true. He had sacrificed himself to save a child. Unli put down her sewing, reached out, and gently placed her hand over his, where it rested on the arm of his chair. His skin was rough and scarred, but warm. He flinched at the contact but did not pull away. It was an anchor, a small point of contact in a world of isolation. The oppressive heat of high summer finally broke, washed away by a series of gentle, overnight rains that left the air clean and crisp. The world seemed new, the dust settled, the colors of the landscape more vibrant. The house, too, felt different. It was no longer a cold, silent prison, but a quiet sanctuary. The scent of her cooking now mingled with the old leather, creating something that smelled almost like a home. One morning, Garrett wheeled himself into the kitchen where she was washing vegetables from the garden. He held out a piece of paper to her. It was a map, hand-drawn with charcoal, the lines surprisingly steady and precise. It showed the ranch house, the barn, and a winding path leading east. A spot by a creek was marked with a small, crudely drawn flower. "There is a stream," he said, his voice even. "To the east. The flowers there, they are like the ones you planted in your garden." He did not need to say more. It was an invitation, a question, a hope. Later that day, they went together. She walked beside him as he pushed his chair along a path she had never known existed. The wheels that had once sounded like a lament now marked a steady, determined rhythm on the damp earth. They reached the stream, a ribbon of silver water chuckling over smooth stones. And just as he had drawn, the banks were carpeted in small, wild blossoms of a delicate blue, almost identical to the herbs she had carefully nurtured. They didn't speak. They sat in the comfortable silence they had built together, listening to the water and the whisper of the wind through the cottonwoods. He was not the broken gunslinger, and she was not the purchased bride. They were simply Garrett and Unli, two souls who had found each other in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, forging a quiet, resilient life from the pieces that remained. The future was an unwritten page, but for the first time, it felt as though they might write it together.